Welcome, welcome. Feel free to take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, the performance is about to commence. So, America was a color. This color. Yeah, I can see the look on your faces. What on earth are you talking about? America's not a color. Well, America was a color. But why? Why is it a color? Well, same reason why when people come up to me and they see that I've got no flags, no languages. I'm Richard Simcott, and I speak Richard Simcottese. In fact, I speak a number of varieties of Richard Simcottese. But before I explain any more about that, I think we need to set the scene. Talk about some ground rules, some things that are important and I think we recognize or don't want to recognize, but are there in our lives nevertheless. Human contradiction. We're complex beings. We're multifaceted beings. We belong to different groups, different tribes, different beliefs, different everything. We love a story. We love a good story. In fact, it's one of the main things that people say, get on stage and tell a story. They'll love it. They'll follow it. We tell our kids stories. We grow up with stories. We tell and retell, and that's what we do. We watch series on TV. We get addicted to a Netflix show that lasts for like a gazillion seasons. We love a story, we watch it grow and change. But we resist change. We don't know what to do with change. Change feels uncomfortable. Sometimes we think we are okay with change because we love the story, right? And the story changes. But we resist change. We love our subjectivity. To the point that we think it's objective. We think that what we think is the most normal thing. I know some of us may say we feel like we're a bit weird, a bit different. But actually, internally, our subjectivity is what we think is objective. Otherwise, why would we believe it? Why would we think it? Because we're right. We're open. Our way is the right way. Our morality is the right morality. Our culture is the right culture. Our logic is the right logic. We experience things. We experience many things. We define things. It's the way that we order the world. It's the way we make sense of things. Because we love a story, we like to know the identity of everything and everyone. Because we resist change, we like something to be static, something to be there, something to define. Something that we can look at as a point of reference, like a compass or a map. We like to be able to order everything around us. We expect things. Because we order things, we expect things to be a certain way. Wait, that was that way, and now it's not? What's going on? We accept things. We accept the status quo. We accept that we should expect things. We accept that map, that compass. We accept what we're supposed to see. We accept the norms. We challenge things, particularly things that diverge from these norms, things that change. This is why we see people on the internet screaming and shouting and getting very excited and angry about all sorts of things. Because we reject things. We reject things that don't fit into what we think should be, what we think is right, what our right is. It doesn't fit in. We get angry about things. We start screaming at people, we start writing things, we start writing comments on videos and getting into discussions and arguments, and we argue about these things. We fight about these things. These things can get physical. We learn from what happened. On the face of it, sounds almost positive, doesn't it? But what is learning? We learn from what happened. We learn that we didn't like that thing. We learn from negative learnings. We learn from positive learnings. It's not just one type of learning, but we learn. And we learn that what we think is right, and that our subjectivity is really an objectivity that the rest should share. And that's the way we go through life. Our language is the original language. Our language is the oldest language. Our language is the hardest language. Of course, in Poland, that's true. Our language is the best language. Our language is the only language. There cannot be others. Threatens our integrity. Threatens who we are. Threatens us being right. Threatens what we know to be true as our objectivity. But language evolution, like all sorts of evolution, I guess, is a thing. Cultural awakening. We talk about people rising up, groups getting together, people asserting their identities and their differences. We talk about this in terms of good and bad, and not just in terms of it happens. There is always a cultural awakening. Balance of power. Can't talk about politics of languages and language learning without thinking about a balance of power. The word that we hear online very often nowadays is privilege. What kind of privilege do you have? Do you recognize your own privileges? As an English speaker, I definitely do. There's a power balance there. Me going out and speaking English, there's a power balance because there are people that want to do what I do. And there are people who do what I do. So my balance of power within any given context is going to be different. But that happens on a group and even a country scale. Community building. Languages and the way we speak, the varieties of language that we have, form our communities. They build our identity. They build what we think is right, what we think is logical, what we think is true, what we think is objective as well. They then build nations. From these communities, we get countries and nations that we see today. And we always like to think that these are stories that we tell, the history of how borders changed. But now it's set. Now we're at the culmination of those centuries of fighting and border changes and flags that we see now. That's all set now. The languages that we hear and we learn now are set. This is the language we learn. Unification, that's the future, unification. If we all get together and we just become unified, then it's all fine. But with unification, we get subjugation. There's always going to be a group that is going to be put down because the balance of power is never equal. Diversity. It's a great word, isn't it? I love diversity. We need to be more diverse. Our team needs to include diversity. Our team needs to be as diverse as possible. Who hears that at work? Yeah? Hear it a lot. We hear it online. We hear it in discussions. It's good to be diverse. But what do people mean by diverse? They mean a melting pot. You bring a bit of something and you talk about the United States of America, a melting pot. What's a melting pot? A melting pot is a hot pot of metals that have their individuality melted to fuse together so that you can no longer recognize the component parts of what that melting pot was. It can be good for unification, but what if there's a little spark of something that seeps out? How does that melting pot really work? Is the diversity in a melting pot? Or is it an amalgamation of everything that we want to take and we all sort of blend in together? I prefer the salad bowl analogy. Salad bowl allows for the tomatoes to be tomatoes, the onions to be onions, the salad to be salad, the corn to be corn, the avocado, if you want avocado in your salad, to be avocado. And you allow all of that to exist with its own unique flavors, tastes, textures. And you can drizzle it with a little bit of dressing, if you like, just to fuse things together a little bit so there's some sort of cohesion. But you don't take away from what those individual component parts are. Conflict. There are real consequences to not recognizing true diversity and to believing that our subjectivity is real objectivity, and to wanting just unification as a melting pot. There is conflict. We see this today too. We see it online playing out before our eyes in a way that we never saw before. TikTok videos of demonstrations and things happening on YouTube that you never heard about before because it wasn't mainstream news. You hear stories of people you could just easily forget and marginalize because you didn't have to worry about them. It can also lead to war. I don't really know if I need to speak much more on that topic, especially at this moment. So, what's the difference between a language and a dialect? How many times have you heard that question? Like a gazillion and one? I don't know. Many, many times. I get this question a lot. I see this question a lot. I see the answers a lot. Let's have a look at some of the answers. So this is the very typical answer that you hear, and it's the most common one that I get as a response when I ask this question on Twitter or other social media platforms. Spraak is een dialect met een Armeeën vlot. And sorry for my Yiddish pronunciation, it sounds very different, I know. It's my version of Yiddish. Remember, I speak Richard Simcottese Yiddish. So, a language is a dialect with an army and navy. I'm guessing a lot of you have seen this and heard this. This is not new for you. This is no revelation. I'm not trying to teach you something that has been untaught or unseen before. This is definitely kind of a trope at this point. Google, what does Google say about languages? Well, languages are broader and dialects are smaller and more specific and often regional. Languages are thought of as more formal and clearly defined, whereas dialects can be looser and more fluid in use. Oftentimes, languages are adopted as official by countries and states, but dialects rarely are. Okay? Google's got an opinion on most things. That's amazing. I just want to leave those with you for a minute because I want to come back to that at the end. Language check with you. Let's have a check and see how many flags we have. We all like to check our badges, right? We all like to see how many languages we have in common, what we speak. Who here speaks exactly the same way as the first people who spoke? Anyone? Okay, let's try and make it a bit easier. Who here speaks exactly the same way as the people from ancient civilizations? I'll take silence as a no. Who here speaks exactly the same way as their ancestors from over 300 years ago? Who here speaks exactly the same way as their great-great-great-grandparents? Okay, you're a very honest group. I like that about you. Who here speaks exactly the same way as their great-great-grandparents? Good, you are very honest. Who here speaks the same way as their great-grandparents? No. Who here speaks the same way as their grandparents? I don't believe you. Who here speaks the same way as their parents, exactly the same way as their parents? No. Oh, yeah, I'm very impressed with this group, seriously. Who here speaks the same way as somebody else here in this room? Who speaks the same way? No? What about if we talk about your siblings? Who speaks exactly the same way as their siblings? No? What about your friends? Who speaks exactly the same way as their friends? No? Who here speaks exactly the same way as themselves 10, 20, or 30 or more years ago? Your awareness is amazing. I love it. This is obviously the right audience for me. And in case any of you did think yes or you didn't want to say yes, because I think most of you got the point of what I'm heading for, AI, ChatGPT, TikTok, YouTube, Google, etc., etc., etc. All of this terminology, all of this language, the way we use it, it's all new. So how on earth could we be speaking exactly the same way as any of this, even ourselves, 10, 15, 20, even 5 years ago sometimes, even yesterday we might be learning new things every day and incorporating them into our languages and speech patterns. Who here speaks a perfect version of any standardized language? I love the honesty. You're so good. You're so good, seriously. I feel like I should clap you at this point. I was expecting more people to tell me, no, I do, of course I do. America was a color. It was, because it's an idiolect. It's the idiolect of Richard Simcottese. Because for me, America was a color in my head. The word America evoked that color. The exact shade, possibly not, that you saw on the screen, because the human mind cannot remember shades of color. But roughly. And my idiolect of Richard Simcottese, also I identify with a dialect, or I did when I was younger. As a Richard Simcottese speaker, my dialect group of people who spoke similarly to me was Scouse. The dialect of Liverpool and some surrounding areas. And the language that I recognized that dialect belonging to was English. As did the other people who spoke Scouse, as did the other people who spoke idiolects that belonged to Scouse. We typically say we speak English. So what's the difference between a language and a dialect? What are the component parts of a language or a dialect? It's important to break it down and to go to the roots and the actual, real, palpable feeling for us as individuals of what that means. So for me, speakers of idiolects who associate themselves with other speakers of similar idiolects might agree that they speak variations of the same dialect. That's my definition that I wrote about idiolects and dialects. If you're a linguist, you may have a problem with it, I don't know, but this is my definition. And speakers of dialects who associate themselves with other speakers of similar dialects might agree that they speak variations of the same standardized language. That's my definition of a dialect and a language and the differences between them. And you'll note that there's quite a difference here between what we saw before with having an army and a navy, and it's all to do with power, the army and the navy. This is all to do with how the groups themselves and the individuals within those groups feel. It's taking away the power from people who want to fight and argue and punch and kill. And it's putting it in the hands of the people it belongs to. Because it's our identities. And our identities matter. Our individual identities matter. And we have the right to be able to identify with whomever we like. We don't have the right to go to other people and tell them who they are and what they speak. That's for them to decide. These standardized languages and dialects and idiolects, they're not fixed, they're constantly changing. America doesn't feel so much like a color to me anymore. The overriding meaning is the United States of America when I first hear the word America. If you add an S to it, the Americas, I will think maybe more about the rest of the continent or continents. But generally speaking, they change. They're not static. And what do humans not like? Change. But what do they like to do? Follow change in the way of stories. The process of standardization. This is kind of a pivotal moment in the recognition for a wider public of what a language is. Not necessarily an all-encompassing thing, but it quite often is a defining thing, and it's something that's often defined by things like the traduction, the translation of the Bible, or other important texts in the culture. The standardization process, though, takes a long time. Before you reach a point that you agree that your idiolects are the same dialect and your dialects are the same language as a community, as a nation, as a country, as a group, as a region of the world, or even regions of the world, there's a lot that goes into that to get to that point. And then the standardization process then can take place. But that is a long road, because you have to agree which words belong to the standard language, which elements of grammar belong to the standard language, which ones are outliers and belong solely to the dialect spoken of that language. This takes a long time, and if you're interested in following any of these types of discussions, debates, you can look at the story of the Cornish language and how that was a real struggle to reach a defining moment where they arrived on a standard written form for the language. And it's still, in some areas, possibly debated to this day. But why do we need to standardize language anyway? What's the point? Why can't we just speak? Well, there are practical reasons for standardizing a language. A standardized form of a language allows us to mass-produce documents, mass-produce materials for people to learn the language or learn through the language, or to communicate in a way that is agreed upon as a medium of understanding. So the word that we agreed was the standard word for this concept is that word that we all use, even if this word has a slightly different flavor or connotation in your specific idiolect or dialect. So it becomes important. It becomes important for many communities where they don't have much representation, where there's a struggle with the power balance, because it means that they have something to point to say, we exist, this is our language. This is our language. We are a group now of 1 million. We are a group of 100,000. We are a group of 500. We're not just me and my mates. And what that means is it can translate into financial benefit. They can get backing or funding to be able to promote the language, to be able to write things in the language, to be able to have television or to produce books or whatever it is. That's why it's important for many people. Not for everyone, for many people. What about language learners, though? I mean, I talked about this politics of language learning, right? But you can't talk about the politics of language learning without talking about the politics of language, and why these definitions are important, and why the sensitivities that go into this discussion are important. As language learners, it also rests on your shoulders. You feel this more so in some languages than others when you're studying them. Questions I often get are, which language variation should I learn? My very easy answer to this is the one that makes sense to you. Whether it's friend groups, whether you're living in a certain area, whether you have materials, but the one that makes sense to you. How do I treat similar languages? Now, this is a question that comes up not as a question necessarily. People will often ask, how do I learn more languages and get my number up? And I want to study all of the languages in one family, and it can be seen in that way. But it's a question that doesn't tend to get asked that often, but I think it's an important one. And my answer is, respectfully. If you hear a language that sounds like a language, or a dialect that sounds like a dialect, or an idiolect that sounds like an idiolect, that you know or you recognize and you label, approach that person and ask them how they identify what they speak, how they see the differences between some things. Find the common ground. Walking up and telling somebody who they are and what they do and what they speak, not so cool. I think as a race, I think we need to move beyond that now. I think we need to move beyond the fact that we're not living in some weird farm or something where there's one person who kind of gets the whip out and beats the people into submission. And I think we can be bigger, and we can go up to people and ask open questions. Talk to them like human beings. Treat them with respect. And show a genuine interest in the variety of the language or dialect that they speak. Thank you. Okay, so let's see if there are any questions. Oh, there is one. Okay. So in America, Yangs should show more respect. Oh my word, I'm not reading this up. That's terrible. Who's written this? To talk, ain't that right? That feels like it could be some sort of offensive thing for me to read out like that. I don't even know if I should answer that question. Any other questions? Yeah, we're going through the app for the questions, just so you know. So if you want to use the QR code, you can ask the question. It should appear on the screen for you. Spoken so much about language, dialects, idiolects, and words that probably the words have been taken out of you now. Okay, here we go. How about flags representing languages? I think it's problematic. I think it's a problematic thing. Because flags actually can intensify the issue of sort of this power balance struggle that we see. Some flags, for example, there are linguistically relevant flags or community flags that people use that are not commonly recognized. And if you were to put them on, you're going to get questions, what on earth is that? Some people might be rude as well about it. Other things like, for example, if I take You could take the US flag. The US flag is a good flag to use for this, because the United States of America doesn't have an official language. But how often do people use it on their badge to mean anything except for English? So there is often a tendency to just suppose that that's what that means. So once something is that strong in people's brain and our mindsets, then how do you move away from that? How do you truly represent them? What is an idiolect? Exactly what I said, the way I speak as an individual and the meanings that I have. They could be because, look, when it comes down to it, all of the languages that we speak are made up. They're all made up in a way. They can be agreed upon in communities and groups in terms of standardization of speech patterns, but they're all made up. The word that we use, why I called that color America as a child, is it could have become a thing had I been born maybe many, many years ago. America could have been the word that we used for that color because I decided that that sounded like the color. So it's kind of arbitrary. But indialect is what you as an individual speak. And my version of Spanish is my version of Spanish. It doesn't belong to anyone else. My version of French is my version of French. It doesn't belong to anyone else. I might even make up my own things in it. Doesn't mean that everyone has to adopt it, and it doesn't mean it's right. It just means it's mine, because it makes sense to me through my mixture of who I am as an individual. Avoiding speaking Russian because of the war, your thoughts. I find it sad that languages get mixed up in politics generally. I am not a fan of this in terms of, I understand that there are emotions attached to it, and I understand that this is a sensitive issue. In terms of not speaking it, as an individual, you have the right to do whatever you want. And I absolutely support your right as an individual to make a decision because it's something that you feel strongly about. Do I think that it's something that I would go for? No, I don't actually have a problem speaking German, for example. In fact, it's one of my favorite languages. Just because we had a war with Germany many years ago doesn't stop me from learning German. It didn't stop me from speaking it and using it and living in Germany at one point. So how far do we take these things? And do individuals represent the greater mass of any one country or one ideology or one community? This is where I'd say the idiolect and the associations and labels that go with the idiolect, whether they do say that their idiolect belongs to a dialect or a language like Russian, that individual has the right to be an individual still. How do you feel? Oh, here we go. How do you feel about using different accents and dialects within your native language? This is something that also has become problematic on online. You see talks of cultural appropriation and possibly even linguistic appropriation. My thought on it is the power balance is important. So if you know where you're coming from, if you know your background, you know your history, and you're imitating an accent that has been ridiculed and mocked, and the people have, as a community, have been through really tough times, oppression, enslavement, is it appropriate for you to be talking like them? Or are you mocking them? There is a grey line, and like there's a grey line everywhere, for every single discussion and debate, for sure. But I think we have to ask ourselves these questions each time we do these things. You know, one of my favorite accents in English is the Indian accent. I love the d and the d sounds that they infuse into the English language. I think it's absolutely beautiful. In fact, I have a prejudicial bias towards that accent that I recognize, and I cannot be trusted to have interviews. I can't trust myself to have an objective interview with somebody who is from India, Bangladesh, or Pakistan, because I will tend towards believing everything they say and want to give them the job. Just because I love the accent, it relaxes me, it makes me feel just really comfortable. I don't know why. I have no idea why. I think it's because in my childhood, I had friends and their parents, and they spoke in that way, their parents spoke in that way, and I just loved it. So it reminds me of a really safe place, a really nice place. So I recognize that I can't be objective. But is it appropriate for me still, even though I come from a very positive way, to imitate that accent in a public way, or that could be perceived as hurtful to a greater public that doesn't know me in that context? No. Not necessarily, no. To demonstrate a difference between speech patterns in a very given context, potentially yes. Okay. Do you think one day language learners will have a significant impact on changing the boring ways languages are taught in schools? I think there's a constant development, and I think obviously we've had a number of talks in this program over these few days here together about AI. There's been a lot of AI buzz around. I think just generally technology and how things are moving forward is going to impact the way we learn and the way we use tools like AI, and that would not exclude languages. I think that there's more of that happening, and I think it's just going to continue. Do you feel it might be more respectful to use variant instead of dialect? Potentially, but I think also we should allow people to use the terminology that they feel is appropriate. I mean, look, you get countries like Switzerland, and they use the word dialect, the Swiss dialect, or Swiss dialects, and they use that terminology at the moment in that way. And there's no stigma attached to it. It depends on the stigmatization. So, for example, if you're saying you just speak a dialect of, in that context, no, because you're weaponizing the word dialect. So context is important when we talk about these kinds of words and use of words and vocabulary, because they are weaponized and they are used to put people down, to make people feel inferior. But generally, is the word dialect problematic? Less so in a linguistic context, less so in a context like this, where I would hope that people would have more of an understanding of the word dialect as actually every language is a dialect. It's a standardized form to become and referenced as a language, because we tend to like to use that term as for the national or the official standardized form. But dialect in and of itself shouldn't be a problem. But I think variation, and I tend to use that form myself, is a nice way to be inclusive. So do you think about learning Ukrainian as a way for support? Yeah, why not? I think you can do what you can do. We all do our bits, right, that we can do in a situation. Learning Ukrainian is a display of solidarity to people that you want to show a display of solidarity to. It's completely fine, and it's completely right if you feel that that's the thing that you want to do and you can do to show a type of support for any community, Ukrainian or wherever. Should names of languages become disconnected from country names? That's a really good question. I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I think it would be an entire presentation. It's an issue that affects generally the inclusion or exclusion of any ethnic or given group to a country as well, because very often, particularly in Europe, our names for our countries are also the names of our languages and nationalities, and the main ethnicity of the country. So it's very difficult to be inclusive of a community, particularly if they are visually different to the main ethnicity. It can be particularly challenging to use those terms, that terminology, to be inclusive. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's a challenge, and I don't have the answer. I'm not going to pretend I have the answer to that, but it is a challenge. And if you can relabel a language, good luck, because there are a lot of people who are attached to it. Languages have always borrowed from other languages, but when people use loan words, one often reacts, yes, they do. What are your thoughts on this? I think, look, languages are fluid. We don't like change. So you get language snobbery. People who say, oh, you should pronounce it this way and not that way. And when does a word become a word? You know, I can't remember who famously said this, but somebody said, the French don't have a word for entrepreneur. Which is beautiful. I mean, it is beautiful. It's beautiful in its silliness, because it means that there's an acceptance of the word from French in English to the point that the person that said that didn't even perceive it. Okay, So there are kind of embedded, in-baked words that typically people don't know the etymology of. It may have even been a word that was offensive. It may have been a racially offensive slur at some point. Even things like that can be lost in language, which is a very interesting thing and highly debatable when people talk about these topics, because people who perceive that slur still can often get into huge conflicts. And you see this online, right? When people argue of, that's actually, you shouldn't use that word, it's offensive. No, but I don't mean it in that way. Yeah, but it's offensive, it means this in this language. But I don't mean it in that way. And they just do not see eye to eye. And you get this with words that enter into the language as just general, normal words that, you know, do you think of table as French? You know, table. I don't know. What is it? What is it? French? Is it English? What is it? It just becomes part of the language, part of the agreed upon language, standardized language potentially, but definitely could be just dialect or idiolect or whatever it is that you use. What languages do you have to study if you want to be left-wing, and which languages would be right wing? Okay, I mean, as somebody, I don't see myself as particularly one wing or another wing. I find that terminology problematic. I like to listen to as many different ideas and thoughts as possible, because if I don't understand a different point of view, how on earth can I even begin to get any semblance of true objectivity in my own life? Because if I just end up listening to myself constantly and people who agree with me or have similar thoughts to my own, I end up in an echo chamber of just, yeah, well done. You've got the right way. You're right. Your logic is the right logic. And that's the problem we have. And it's actually becoming more and more of a problem in today's society, because we create these us and them on many different topics. How should we better promote non-Indo-European languages in our community? By learning them, maybe. By starting groups. By starting conversation groups. By having language exchanges. By having tandems. Having all these things to kind of encourage, show people who speak these languages that this is the thing that we want. Showing each other that we can practice this language together. That we can learn this language together. Then coming to events like these and writing that you speak that language, maybe, because the balance of power is always going to be different. So seeing that might make somebody else think, oh yeah. You know, seeing German or French or Spanish or whatever, it's like, okay, well, I've never heard of those languages before. I'll go out and learn one. That's never going to happen, right? No one's going to think like that about those languages. But a language, I don't know, like the Maasai language, for example, yeah, you would potentially want to highlight that on your tag. Let's see. When I was at school, we got into terrible trouble for speaking our local language. Never thought much about it until now. Do you know how common this still is around the world? Very common, still, yes. So, in fact, from my own island of origin, the Great Britain, the Scots language, this happens to children who speak Scots, a language that has various varieties, and they agree that it's Scots, to a degree. Some don't. And very complicated, but when they speak Scots in schools, it's corrected as bad English. Except for that 1 week a year where they read Robbie Burns and are celebrated for memorizing poetry. It's kind of a weird thing, but yeah, that happens. It still happens, and people are mocked for speaking a certain way. If I were to give this presentation in my original dialect or idiolect of English, I doubt I would, or if I'd spoken in all of my interviews in that way, I doubt I'd have been taken as seriously. I doubt people would think I was educated in the same way. But because I moved towards a standard northern pronunciation of the English language, it's more acceptable. What if the speaker of a minoritized language themselves don't feel their language is worth keeping, using, saving? That's for the individual to decide, and there are people who protect their languages. And this is why respectfully is the last word that I ended the presentation on. If there's a group that doesn't want to engage in this, who am I or who are you to say, yes, you must? We can talk to them. Maybe they may change their mind, but we shouldn't have it as a goal to change the mind. Our goal should always be an open dialogue, communication to see, and they may or may not decide that that is actually a viable or good option for them. Because we haven't necessarily been through the same struggles, the same history as them and their families. We haven't heard their stories. We don't know their feelings. We don't know what their day-to-day life is, struggling to speak the language. It's not black and white, and it's not a case of you should do this because we think it's right here. Particularly the West, we're very kind of, Western countries generally, I do feel that we'll often get on our high horse, our moral high horse, and tell people that what we do is the right thing, and you should also do the same thing because we see better, we see more clearly. We're at the top of the mountain now, and we see everything. We don't. We really don't. We see what we think we see. We're at the top of one mountain, we're at the bottom of another mountain, who knows? Who knows where we are? So open dialogue and actually interacting with people as a human being and as an individual is key. I'm sorry we've got loads of questions, but I'll do my best to get through. Can you extrapolate the sequence of definitions from idiolects through dialects and languages all the way to the whole world when speakers of languages associate? No. That's an easy question to answer. No, I can't. It would be very difficult, especially in the time I don't have. When did you stop speaking Scouse to most people? Probably the age of 11 it started to really disappear because I went to a high school where I started mixing with a friend group that spoke in a different way. And so my idiolect started shifting and my, therefore, normal pattern of speech shifted. What do you do about monolingual communities not appreciating... sorry, I'll go to that one and then the Polish one. Appreciating your idiolect but trying to fit you into the standard way of speaking. What can I do? I can just talk and hope that they will see something different. Open communication again. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But, you know, I have one philosophy in my life. You all have the right to think of me what you will. And I have zero rights to your thoughts, zero. Your opinions of me, you could think anything, the worst things in the world about me. I have zero rights to that. My right stops at your nose. And your rights stop at my nose. As long as I'm not doing anything to inflict pain, damage, or anything to you, our internal thoughts and our opinions on idiolects, dialects, or whether it's acceptable, not acceptable, as long as we're not infringing on people's rights to be and exist and as individuals, because we hopefully no longer feel threatened with our own identity just because of their existence, that's kind of where I stand on this. What are your favorite idioms in English and Polish, respectively? I don't know. I can't think off the top of my head. My mind's not there at the moment, unfortunately. Have you seen many salad bowls around? Not really. I wish I could say yes, but not really. It's a kind of a dream that we could just live in that kind of way. But as soon as you enter into it, even the salad bowls feel that there's a bit of a cutting into the tomato to mix it in with something else. But I wish it was more like that. As you speak so many languages, did you ever consider working as a diplomat? I did, and I did. I used to be in the Foreign Office in the United Kingdom, so I worked as a diplomat. How did you think we should deal with the guilt of loss of motivation in language learning? Best way to reconnect with languages we had stopped practicing. Introspection, reflection, consideration of goals and realistic opportunities to use a language and to get the language in your life. That's probably a short answer. Longer answer would take many hours probably. What do you think is consciousness of how does language and silence relate to it? Oh. Language and non-language. So, I mean, non-verbal, you have non-verbal. So you have languages, for example, speech and language that's not audible. We have sign languages. We have languages as well that don't use words per se. They may use whistles. They may use humming. There are many different ways to communicate. And silence sometimes is golden. And I'll stop there.